Ni hao, and welcome to Asian History today in World History class. We're going to do just a little bit of culture and then we'll do some Asian history. Now understand that if we did Chinese history, we could probably do it from now until the rest of your life and not learn everything. So we're going to just focus on some of the big things so at least you know some knowledge. And we're going to focus on 3 countries. We're going to compare China, Korea, and Japan. Obviously, there are other Asian countries, but we're going to focus on those just to begin. So you're going to need 2 notes out. Basically, have your Asian culture comparison notes out. We'll do those a little bit, and then we'll end with our top 8 in history stuff. Okay? So we're going to split it into thirds. This is the first third. So remember, today we're going to learn a little Chinese. To say hello in Chinese, we say ni hao. Repeat after me, ni hao. Now, if you're talking to just your friends, hanging out, you would just say hi or hey like we do. But if it's someone out of respect or someone you've never met before, you would say ni hao. Now, what I found interesting is they don't typically bow in China today unless it's a really, really formal occasion. They wouldn't expect an American to do that. But it is somewhat expected in other countries we're going to talk about. To say thank you, you say 谢谢, and I'm really bad at Chinese, so bear with me. So say 谢谢. And to say goodbye in Chinese, we say 再见. 再见, repeat after me. 再见. There you know. You know some Chinese words. What a deal. Now, before we get started, remember we did a little tea ceremony in our first video, so check that out. And I want to do a little special shout out to one of my students. Kota was a Japanese student who was here in America, and he really helped me with a lot of the information from Japan and did some of these slides. So thank you, Kota. All right, so let's talk about clothing. We're going to talk about Korean clothing. That is called hanbok, H-A-N-B-O-K. And let me show you what it looks like. So this is Korean hanbok. If you were here today, you guys would actually be wearing these in class, so we do what we can. Notice that hanbok is really easy to identify. It's got a very flowing skirt, and the little top is almost like a baby doll top. It only goes about halfway down, and it ties over along the side. This one is, I don't know, maybe $200, but some of the wealthier ones will be over $1,000. So that would be hanbok. And if you look at these pictures, these countries are all about symbols and animal symbols and insects. They're all different, but they all have symbols. So if you'll notice, the king and queen wore the symbol of a dragon. So that would be a king and queen's outfit. The guy standing next to me here, these are military advisors or leaders because they're wearing a crane or a tiger, and that was their symbol. You'll notice the black hat. That is the tradition. Now in Korea, what I love about it is they still have clothing like we do. They wear jeans and sweatshirts, but they also wear this stuff in special occasions like weddings or graduations. So you'll see both as you walk down the street, honestly. These are all wealthy people because if you were lower class in the old days, you only could wear white. It was very, very plain and very simple, and then you could wear a black hat, and that was it. Here's some other examples. One of the things I thought was really interesting, I've seen these fans like my whole life, and I thought they were just for show, and sometimes they are for looks, but I found that in Korea they use these all the time because it gets really humid in the summer, so you'll see them sitting in class fanning themselves with one of these instead of our little electronic fans. The other thing that you'll see is they always have an umbrella with them for a couple of reasons. First of all, it has a rainy season, and boy, when it rains, it pours. So they would have something much tougher than this one. This is a dress umbrella, and it floods pretty quickly. This would be one that they would just wear on a summer day because they don't want to get sun on their face or on their arms or their hands. Obviously, because it's not good for your skin. But if you look back at their history, lower class people had a tan because they had to work outside. So it was not something people wanted. They didn't want to have a tan in their culture. It was good to have a very light face, which is why if you look at like dancers way back, they powdered their face to be nice and white. So sometimes you'll even see women walking down the street with white gloves on, protecting their skin. Okay. Now, if you look over here, the outfit that I'm wearing is actually a bridal dress, believe it or not. Most women in Korea actually have two wedding dresses. They have one like this, that's the traditional hanbok, and they also have a white wedding dress, like the Western tradition. These ladies here are also wearing very fancy clothing, and they're both, you'll notice there's something that's different between these two. Let me show you a close-up. This would have been an outfit that a woman would have worn out on the street. Maybe they were going to get fruit from a fruit vendor. This one would be something that they wore in the palace, because you'll see it has a lapel right here. Well, while you were in the palace, you never showed your hands. So you would tuck them underneath this lapel, and you would wear something like this. Okay? Now, I haven't shown you, oh my goodness, how to actually bow in the old Korean tradition, but we'll get to that on a different day. How about? Okay? It's quite a deal. So let's go on to Japan. Japan wears what we call a kimono. Now, there are two things to really look for with a kimono. I am actually wearing a Japanese kimono from World War II. My grandpa was in World War II in Japan, and he brought this back for my mom, and also this one is a guy's kimono. These are pretty basic. They're just made out of cotton, so this is something you would wear around the house. But one of the things you'll notice about their sleeves, see how it's kind of boxy like that? That is a real tradition for kimonos, so you'll see that quite often. And the other thing to look for is if you look on the back, you'll see a big old sash, and then they have a nice big bow called an obi sash, which is kind of cool. So those are those things that you want to look for a kimono. So again, women in Japan wear regular clothing, but they wear these for fancy ceremonies, especially the coming of age ceremony when they turn 20. When women turn 20, that means she is a woman, and she's now old enough to get married and start settling down for the rest of her life. Let's talk about feet a little bit. In the Japanese culture, they wore what are called Geisha shoes, and I have a pair, but one of my students borrowed them, and so I hope I get those back. But you'll see they're very tall, and they're made out of wood, so you can imagine how slow and careful you have to walk, kind of flat-footed. That's why. And then they also wore these little tabby socks that have a little split between the toes. In the Japanese culture, women wear white for their wedding. But the wedding dresses in Japan are so ungodly expensive that they usually rent them. So that is what you'll see here. This kind of bubble-looking thing is called a wataboshi, and it's designed to hide her horns of jealousy, because, of course, all women are jealous, to make her a more gentle wife. You'll notice that guys also wore kimonos way back. Now, remember, this is the traditional samurai gear. We obviously don't have any samurai because we know from our previous revolutions that the samurai are no more. But when they weren't in their battle gear, they wore kimonos. Today, they wear kimonos for weddings and things. The colors are just a little more muted, less patterned, typically. In China, they wear what's called hanfu. Now, take a look at those colors. Brilliant colors, very flowing material. That's typically what you would look for in China. This is an example of a somewhat cheaper version of those. This is hanfu. You'll notice that they wrap around either the waist or up here. They have a long skirt, and again, it's very flowing material. So that would be hanfu. Here's some examples of men's hanfu. Again, the fancy ones are made out of silk, that kind of stuff, or satin. Emperors in China wore yellow, and they wore the sign of the dragon again. So this would be an emperor's outfit. Look at this. In China, they wear red for a wedding. So let's ask why. Well, red is a good luck color, and it chases evil spirits away. You'll also notice that the bride wears a veil or beads over her face, and we do that in our culture, don't we? Sometimes we wear a veil. But in their culture, they don't take away that veil or those beads to show their face until all the guests are gone and they're alone with their husband. It is that special moment where they get to share their beautiful face with their loved one. So, kind of a cool tradition. Now, in the south of China, the bride actually makes or wears a pair of shoes that are embroidered with symbols again of either a turtle or a deer, which shows good luck and blessings for their marriage. They have some other really cool traditions. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but let me just kind of talk about them. They have what's called the 3 letters and 6 etiquette. So what happens before you can get married, there's a lot of things that happen first. So letters are exchanged between the 2 families, basically asking for her hand. And every time you do, you send a gift from your family. It's all about giving gifts when you visit somebody in their culture. And then you accept their gift. Then we have what's called the 6 etiquette. These are 6 customs that happen. First, an emissary is sent by the groom's family to persuade the bride's family of their interest in the daughter. The groom's family then requests the bride's birth date and time. The couple's birth dates are given to a fortune teller who decides if the couple is a good match, believe it or not. And now they actually just use a calendar. But they do look to see if their birth dates match. If compatible, the groom's family then sends more gifts to the bride's family, showing that they've made it through that step. The groom's family then sends more formal gifts. Then the fortune teller actually selects a good luck wedding date. The night before, this is kind of special, the mom and the daughter have what's called the hair combing ceremony. So you can imagine I'm combing my daughter's hair, right? The first combing symbolizes from beginning to end. Put those up there so you can see those. Okay. The second combing means harmony from youth all the way to old age. The third combing is a wish for many grandbabies, of course. And the fourth combing offers hope for wealth and a marriage that lasts a long, long time. Have a special moment. Now, on the wedding day, it's not done yet. The groom and the groomsmen actually fetch the bride, but before she will come out of the house, they have to do something to embarrass themselves, like dancing in the yard or singing a song, and then eventually she will actually come out of the house. At that point, then what happens is the groom and the future bride actually go and serve a tea ceremony to her parents as a thank you for raising her. Then he brings her to his home, where they will do a tea ceremony for his parents that shows that she's now a part of their family. And then they finally go to the church and get married, which is honestly the shortest part of this whole thing, believe it or not. The reception is actually much more important than the ceremony in this culture. The reception is very, very elaborate, and I've been told that the couple will go in debt. The parents will go in debt for the rest of their lives for this particular reception. The more dresses that the bride wears in China, the more sign of wealth. So you can imagine this woman may have 4 or 5 dresses by the time the night ends. Some traditional red, some white, any colors she wants, to be honest. So it's kind of interesting, very much about spending money here. So again, remember we said the red color means good luck. So for example, the guests will give them envelopes that are red. That's a sign of good luck. And the bride and groom may even have red linens on their honeymoon bed as a sign of good luck that they'll have grandchildren or babies coming up. So kind of some cool traditions to share with you there. Here's some different things that have been handed down in fashion from Japan. We have the Tang jacket. You have these little accessories here. We've got the Mao suit, named after Mao Zedong. We've talked about him. And this is Cheongsam. You'll notice this has been used and is still used in fashion today. You see the side panel there, and that it really accentuates the shape of the female physique. Beautiful. Usually made out of satin or silk. This one is not so pretty. This is called foot binding. Foot binding was done for years, and it was a sign of beauty and grace, and it was a way to get married, because typically a guy was looking for a woman with very dainty feet. Yeah. So this is what would happen when the girl was little, probably, I don't know, maybe a year old, maybe 2 years old. The mother would actually take the foot, and here, let me use this thing. They'd take the foot, and they'd break the bones in the foot like this, and then they would wrap it like this so that her foot would heal like that. So she'd be walking on her toes and her heel at the same time, if you can imagine. The goal was to get her to 3 inches, believe it or not. Can you imagine fitting in a 3-inch shoe? That's what Oprah's holding right there. And the idea was it was to be in the shape of a lotus flower, which I don't quite get that, but you can imagine what it did to these women's feet. And that's also why they were very dainty about the way that they walked. It was actually outlawed, believe it or not, in 1912, but some families in China kept doing it, especially in smaller villages up in the mountains and stuff like that. So, kind of an interesting thing. But, in the long run, think about it, ladies. Why do we wear high heels? Is it good for our feet? Does it make them feel good? Makes our legs look nice. Makes us look pretty, but it's not good for our feet. So, maybe it's similar in some ways. Okay, I'm going to quickly go over some food here. This is typically the kind of food that you'll find in Korea. Obviously, seafood is huge because it's a peninsula, a lot of water around it. So there's seafood out on the street that you can buy. Notice we sit on the ground usually. And we have all kinds of dishes, and we just basically grab and put some on our plate. Other things, this is a really common dish in Korea. It's called kimchi. It's basically cabbage that has been sauced and pickled. And they have all these big jars behind the restaurants and behind their houses. They'll buy a whole batch of cabbage and they'll basically can it like we do here. And they have kimchi with every meal. And they all have their own recipes. So these are all different styles of kimchi. Wasn't my favorite, but to each their own. You'll also notice they have a lot of fruit. And in their culture, the sweets that we eat would be too sweet for them. You might have a little thing of chocolate on top of a cheesecake, or you might have fruit with yogurt. That was typically a dessert, or watermelon might be your dessert in Korea. Here are just some other examples of things you might find. In Japan, here are some examples of things you might find there. We have gohan, or rice, oshiru, which is soup, and okazu, which is fish and vegetables. This was one of Koda's favorites. This is donburi mono. This is rice with food on top, like fried shrimp or chicken, something like that. This is guidon. This is beef with rice. What's really interesting to me is, when we think of certain foods, we always think of a certain culture. Like when we think of sushi, we think of Japan. And the truth is, yes, Japan has sushi, but they only use that for very special occasions, like doing well on a test, a graduation, something like that. So it's not something that they eat every day. Ramen noodles, they do have in Japan, but it actually gets its roots from China, actually. They have a lot of noodles in China as well. Now this one I thought was rather interesting, seeing as we have wrestling in our family. This is what sumo wrestlers would eat. Now, you wrestlers, tell me, what are these sumo wrestlers supposed to do? What is the goal of sumo wrestling? Yep, it's to push him out of the ring or push him onto his butt or get him to fall down, okay? That means you lose and the other guy gets a point, right? So they have to be big and strong and wide. So you can imagine eating fish every day. You don't gain a lot of weight with food like that. So what they eat is a special diet called chankanabe. Chankanabe is basically a stew of meat. It's all protein. So you see all this meat is mixed in here, and they eat this many, many times a day so that they can gain weight. What I found interesting is some of them are very superstitious because, if you get knocked over, you lose, right? So they won't eat a cow, for example, because a cow is on 4 legs. And if they're on 4 legs or arms and legs, it means they lose. So some of them would only have chicken, for example, because it stands on 2 feet, or animals that stand on 2 feet. In China, the first thing to remember is that China is huge. So there are totally different styles depending on where you live. It's a fifth of the world. In southern China, every meal is pretty much with rice because there's a lot of rice patties in the south. In northern China, they prefer wheat fields, so they eat bread or noodles with every meal. Have any of you had mantou or steamed bread? Oh, so good. It's kind of like our breakfast, like rolls. It's got that steam. Oh, so good. For breakfast, they may eat rice porridge, chicken noodle soup for breakfast, and pastries like donuts like we have here. Their favorite lunch times, egg rolls, you probably had that. We have that here. Or bao, or Chinese dumplings. Good stuff. Have you ever seen Kung Fu Panda loves dumplings. Now, in a certain region, in Canton, right down here in China, they are known for these particular foods. So when you eat this stuff, it isn't everybody in China, it's this region. So many Chinese, they have wonton soup, for example, or suckling pig, which is cut up like this, and stir fry. Stir fry is actually a Cantonese dish, not an all-over Chinese dish. So you'll find that down there. And you'll notice that Korea, Japan, and China even are different based down to their chopsticks, believe it or not. Japan's chopsticks are shorter because when they eat, they bring their bowl up to their mouth, so they don't need something very long. They eat mostly fish, so they don't eat anything that really needs to tear a whole lot because the fish kind of falls apart. In Korea, you'll notice they use metal chopsticks like this. Took me a while to figure these out because they're kind of slippery. But they need it more because they eat foods like kimchi that they have to tear. So they use metal, actually. And they even use a spoon for rice, which I did not know. Makes it a lot easier to pick up those pieces of rice than to try to do this, one by one. It's very difficult. In China, they use wooden, long chopsticks because they basically eat from the table. And what they do is they hold them together and then they scoop like the rice up like this. So, and they also have the greasiest food of all three. That would slip right off of these ones in Korea. So that's why they use some real basic wooden ones for China. Okay, so we're going to stop here now, and then we're going to go into our top 8 notes. And we're just going to do the first third. Now understand, these first 8 are Chinese history, but obviously they may influence the countries around them. So you're going to see that Korea and Japan might actually be involved. Let me move these so you can see this map over here. I've got a little Chinese map for you to look at as we go here. Huge country. So first of all, have any of you seen this picture before? Kind of a famous event. It's known as the Tiananmen Square incident to us, and we're going to learn about this today. Notice this one person is standing in front of all of those tanks. Talk about a brave person, and he was like just a few years older than you. He was a college student. All right, so what we're going to do is just look at the top 8 big events in China's history. Obviously, there are a lot of others. So we're going to start with the Opium War, 1839 to 42. So if you put this in place of our timeline, this is before the Civil War, okay? Well, here's what was happening. The British East India Trading Company was getting opium from India, and it was selling it in China. So guess who the drug dealer is in this story? It's England. England is the drug dealer, and they're selling this opium in China. The Chinese government was furious because people were getting addicted to opium. So Lin Zexu here, he asked Queen Victoria, please stop selling this crap in my country because it's hurting my people. And she said no. So Lin Zexu said, well, I'll try to deal with it a different way. They blockaded all of their ports from British ships so that they couldn't bring the opium in. So the British decided to attack. Remember, the British have the most powerful navy in the world. So obviously the Chinese are no match for the British Navy, and they have to negotiate. So they signed the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842. It said, number 1, these 5 ports will be open for trade with England. Number 2, they would have low taxes on British goods. Number 3, they had to pay all the cost of the war, even though England was the one that attacked. Isn't that crazy? And number 4, they had to give the British Hong Kong, which is why Hong Kong tends to be a little different from the rest of China, because it has a different government system. It's more similar to the Western ways, I would say. And notice, no mention of the opium trade, and they just kept selling. Number 2 event is the Taiping Rebellion. This should be a review. We mentioned this in our rebellion unit, but just to kind of go over the big things, 1850 to 64, this was the rebellion led by Hong Xuan. Remember? He was the guy that thought he was the brother of Jesus. He basically said that God had given him a vision to fight for control of China. He fought for people's rights, land distribution, and for women's rights. Here are some women that fought for him and are going to be executed. But he fought for peasants' rights. So think of this kind of like the French Revolution, only it's in China, fighting for the lower class. Remember, they wouldn't wear a queue in the back. Remember, that's a braid, a men's braid. So they were actually nicknamed the long hairs because they refused to do that. Over 20 million people killed in the Taiping Rebellion. Now, what happened in the end? With the help of the British and the U.S., the government basically put down Huang Xuan's rebellion and he was executed. In fact, if you remember, they put his ashes in a cannon and shot him all over so that his soul would never rest in eternity. The next event is the 100 Days Reform. We've mentioned this a little bit. 1898, the leader was Guangxu. He wanted to try out some of those Western things that America was doing. So he tried schooling for everybody, free press, weapons like we had, like guns, cannons, things like that. Did not go well at all. The people did not take to it. It was a total failure. So as a result, he was put in prison by his very own aunt. And she took over and took power. This is Empress Zixi. Remember her? Yeah. So she put him in prison. Number 4 is the Boxer Rebellion. Again, this is a review from our revolutions. 1899, a guy named John Hay comes over from the United States. He was the U.S. Secretary of State, and he went in and basically said, China, you are going to trade with the United States or else. Okay? They signed the open door policy that said China will trade with the rest of the world. Basically, we did it to make sure we didn't get excluded from that deal. And as a result, the Boxers rebelled. Now, do you remember? Why were they called Boxers? Remember? They thought if they did moves like this, that the bullets would go past them and they would be impervious to death. So we thought it looked like boxing. They were actually called the Society of Harmonious Fists. That's what they were called. Yes, they used shadow boxing to avoid bullets. They hated Westerners. Hated them, people like us. So who did they target? The people that were there were missionaries. So they started killing missionaries from the U.S., from England, Germany, and their families. Women, children, didn't matter. As a result, then, all of those Western countries are hearing about their missionaries getting killed, so they went in and they put down the Boxer Rebellion. Here, I love this cartoon. Notice all these countries are kind of dividing up China. So, yes, it ended up putting down the rebellion, but as a result of this, the government in China becomes very weak, and we just kind of start pushing that government around a lot there. Number 5 is the Revolution of 1911, and we haven't talked about that one yet. This guy right here, Sun Yat-sen, defeated this cute little guy. This is Henry Puyi. Henry Puyi is known as the Child Emperor because he was this old when he took over. You talk about an interesting story. Check out the movie about Henry Puyi. It's really interesting. We'll talk about him again. But anyway, he led a rebellion, took over the government, and he started the Revived China Society. He wanted Western ways, but he knew that he had to do it in pieces because they definitely weren't ready for a lot of it because too much change would be scary. So what happens? Why is this important? Why do we study it? This is the end of the Qing dynasty and the start of China being a republic. Remember? And to the republic for which it stands, where the people are supposed to have a say in their government. That was kind of the idea. And remember, when we say Qing dynasty, we're saying that this family line kept putting someone in charge, like the Louis in France. But now we've taken them out of the ring. Number 6 is the Sino-Japanese War. And you see this purple outline? This means that all 3 of our countries are involved in the Sino-Japanese War. Happened from 1894 to 1895. It's only 9 months long. Who was fighting? It was the Qing dynasty in China versus Meiji Japan, believe it or not. So China and Japan are fighting, and they're fighting over Korea, believe it or not. So here's Japan down here, here's China, and they're fighting over Korea. Why Korea? Well, first of all, Japan is concerned about their national security. So what they're thinking is they want to use this kind of like a buffer zone. So if China's going to invade them, they're going to hit Korea first, and they'll fight on Korea's territory instead of on their home territory, and vice versa. China was worried about the same thing. Korea had a lot of coal and iron ore, and they needed that for all their ships and their trains that were being built at the turn of the century. And Korea had this imaginary boundary outside them, and they wanted nothing to do with the rest of the world. They were kind of like China and Japan at one point, and this forced Korea to trade with the rest of the world. Okay? So I'm not going to go on this for time's sake and show you this video, but they actually have real footage of an 1895 battle. I didn't even know that was possible. This was fought on land and on sea. And you'll notice here is a picture of the Japanese beheading the Chinese soldiers here. Let's take a look at the results. The stats, China had 630,000 that fought, Japan had 240,000. Now again, I don't want you to memorize these numbers, but what does that tell you about those stats? Japan was outnumbered 3-1. Yeah, you got it. Look at the casualties. China had 35,000. Japan had 5,000 casualties. So China had more casualties. And there were 12,000 that died of just disease during this war. Now, by looking at this political cartoon, tell me who won. Was it China or Japan, and how do you know? If you said Japan, you are completely right. Why? Because he's in samurai gear. And notice he's showing big, fat China is killed by tiny little Japan. The reason this event is important is nobody thought a little country like that could beat a big country. We equated power with amount of land back then. So we never thought a little country would beat China like that. Absolutely. So we actually thought it was kind of a fluke. The result, China sued for peace but officially lost. They knew they were losing. They signed the Triple Intervention of 1895, and here's what they agreed to. They both said they would leave Korea alone. But Japan said, I will only leave it alone if you pay us money. So China paid them 13,000 tons of silver in reparations, which was 6 times the Japanese government's revenue, by the way. And they ignored it in the end, and they went into Korea anyway. But they still got a lot of money out of it. By the way, this is where the Chinese actually remember that little cute emperor, the Chinese Emperor Puyi? They put him back in power again. And then if you look at his history, in World War II, he gets taken as a hostage and actually lives to be an old man, but lives to not be in power anymore too. So, very interesting guy. Again, why is this important? This is the beginning of Japan becoming a world power. And we still think it might be a mistake. This actually is the surrender of the Chinese delegates. It's actually incorrect because they showed Ding here surrendering. He actually committed suicide before his defeat and never did surrender. Number 7 event is the War of Liberation, otherwise known as the Chinese Civil War, 1927 to 1936. And then, believe it or not, then they got attacked during World War II by the Japanese, so they stopped killing each other. And then when World War II was over, they went back to killing each other again. Doesn't make any sense, does it? So then they fought from 45 to 49. Who was fighting? The Republic of China, known as the Kuomintang government, or KMT government, versus the Communist Party of China, or the PLA, People's Liberation Army. The Kuomintang were led by Chiang Kai-shek, that you see right here. The Communist PLA were led by Mao Zedong. And you'll notice that his name is spelled 2 different ways, depending. You'll see it's spelled Z-E-D or T-S-E. Either way, same guy, okay? So what happens? Which side do you suppose the United States supported? What do we hate in 1900? We hate communists, right? So we decided to support the KMT government. We threw them tons and tons of money, and they still lost. Oh my gosh, they still lost. So what happened? This group actually took off, and they settled in Taiwan, which is why we still have a pretty good relationship with Taiwan today. And their government is somewhat more similar to the Western ways. So we do a lot of trade with them. What happened in China? Why is this important? This is where China becomes communist. And they changed the name to the People's Republic of China. Okay? 8 million casualties. Horrible, horrible war for them. Only second to the Taiping Rebellion, which was the most bloody war in history. Number 8 is actually this picture that I showed you at the very beginning. This is 1989. It's called the Tiananmen Square or June 4th incident in China, actually. What happened is there were some college students that decided they were going to protest the government's control of them. They're not allowed to watch what they want on TV, listen to the music they want, that kind of stuff. And so they decided to protest in Tiananmen Square. The military went into high gear and they sent in troops. They sent in tanks and soldiers with gas canisters, and they enacted martial law to remove the students. The students stepped in the way of the tank. This is the picture I remember on the front of like Time magazine when I was in high school. It was kind of a big deal. What you maybe don't know is this. This event did not stop right there at Tiananmen Square. That's why they call it the June 4th incident. It sparked rebellions in over 400 other cities. The interesting part is we have no idea how many people died. Deaths range from 0 to 2,600. Casualties anywhere from 0 to 10,000 because we are not allowed to know that information. Kind of interesting, huh? All right, so at this point, what I would do is before we go into our part 2, I would go and do your questions on Wiser, do section 1, and then we'll go into part 2 on Japan, okay? Zaijian, we should say goodbye. Zaijian.